Okay, everyone, we are back here for our Chapter 5 lecture video. Chapter 5 will cover the integumentary system. Now, if we can remember from our Chapter 1 lecture video, the integumentary system is made up of the skin, the hair, the finger and toenails, as well as our sebaceous and sudoriferous glands. So the integumentary system covers the body. It serves as a covering, and it serves a protective function for the body. But as we will see when we get into Chapter 5, the integumentary system is going to do a lot more than just giving our body protection. So let's jump into Chapter 5. So the integumentary system, as I mentioned on the last slide, is made up of the skin. There's a few layers of the skin, which we will talk about this evening, so you'll be more familiar with this. It's made up of the hair, as well as our nails, finger and toenails. We have oil and sweat glands, which can be called sebaceous and sudoriferous glands, as well as the different sensory receptors that we find sitting in our skin. Now, if we look at all the things that these components will do for us, we'll see some of the functions on the right side of the page. So, helping to maintain body temperature. This is also called thermoregulation. This is possible due to the sweat glands that we have in our skin. Sweat, when we get hot, we're going to sweat. That's going to release fluid onto our skin, and that's going to evaporate off and take the heat with it. So thermal regulation is one of our major functions of the integumentary system. We're also going to learn in this lecture video how the integumentary system is going to help make the active form of vitamin D. As the integumentary system is found surrounding the outside of our body, this is going to help to provide different sensory information to our brains. So since the integumentary system is found most externally on our bodies, this is going to help serve as a liaison between the external environment and the internal environment. And we'll also have a number of other ways in which the integumentary system is going to play into all of the other body systems in our body as a whole. So the integumentary system, and in fact all of the body systems, will all work together. They all work with each other and help each other out. And so we'll see that here. So let's look here in the center at some of the more localized contributions of the integumentary system to the body as a whole, and then we'll see how the integumentary system is going to help out with some of these different systems. So as we look at the integumentary system, skin and hair are going to be providing barriers from external stimuli from making it into the inside of our bodies. So this is a protective function. This is going to serve as a barrier between the inside of our bodies and the outside of our bodies. We're also going to have different glands, sweat glands, and oil glands that are going to be helping to thermoregulate our body as well as provide protective functions as well. So these are some of the more classic contributions of the integumentary system. But let's look at a few of these. Let's look at a few of these other systems and how the integumentary system plays into them. So we won't touch on every single one of these, but I'm just going to highlight a few of these systems that I find to be especially important. So skin is serving as a first line of defense. This is our protective function. So this is how the integumentary system plays into the lymphatic system and the immune system. We're also going to have certain cells that can be found within our skin that are going to help to phagocytize foreign particles. So a particular cell known as intraepidermal macrophages, which are going to be a type of cell that belongs to the integumentary system and are found within the skin. These particular cells, these are going to help to participate in immune responses. So the integumentary system is playing a role here with the lymphatic system as well. We also have the respiratory system. With the respiratory system, we have hairs found in the nose, and these are going to act as a filter for certain particles that are coming into the respiratory system. One thing that we're going to learn tonight is that the skin is going to help activate vitamin D. So when we go out into the sun, sunlight's going to hit our skin, and that's going to activate vitamin D. And vitamin D is very, very important for the absorption of calcium. Vitamin D is very important for the absorption of calcium. And so essentially when we eat something with calcium in it, it's important for us to be able to absorb it. And that's what vitamin D does. Vitamin D sort of attaches to calcium, and that's going to help us to be able to absorb both vitamin D and calcium so that we can bring calcium into our bodies and get that very important mineral. And we'll see with a lot of these that the activation of vitamin D is going to help a lot of these other systems as well. So for example, our body needs calcium for a lot of things, and we can't get calcium unless we have active vitamin D. So anything that requires calcium in our bodies is going to need the integumentary system in order to absorb that calcium. So there's going to be calcium ions that are required for muscle contraction, and this is how this is going to help our muscular system. Our muscles will contract based on the release of certain calcium ions in muscle fibers. So the muscular system is also going to require the integumentary system to allow for the absorption of calcium. Calcium is also going to need it in order to make strong bones. So calcium is one of the minerals in our bones that makes our bones very hard and rigid. And so calcium is going to be playing into the skeletal system as well. So like I said earlier, I'm not going to go over every single one of these, but I just want to show you how integral the role of the integumentary system is for all of our body systems. And what we will come to learn is as we go through these body systems, all of our different body systems are going to in turn help out all of our body systems. So each one of these systems is going to help each of the other systems out in some way. So this is what's very interesting about our bodies is even though we have separate systems, they're all going to help each other maintain our body's homeostasis. So we'll be starting to talk about the skin and its different layers, and then we'll get into the different accessory structures that can be found within the skin. So as we look at the skin is going to have two major layers. We have the outermost layer, and then we have a layer that lies just below that. So the outermost layer is the epidermis, and we can call this the most superficial layer as well. This is going to contact the external environment. That's the epidermis. If you go and you touch your skin, you are touching the epidermis. Anything that contacts your skin immediately will touch the epidermis as long as that skin is intact in that area. The dermis is going to be a layer that lies just beneath the epidermis. The dermis is going to be made up of more connective tissue, while the epidermis is going to be made up of epithelial tissue. Now, epi, this prefix here, epi, is going to mean upon. Epi means upon or on top of something else. So the epidermis lies above the dermis. That's why we call this the epidermis. Now, there's a third layer known as the hypodermis, but this is not actually considered a layer in the skin. This is often called the subcutaneous layer because it is found just below our cutaneous membrane. And we tend to have a lot of areolar connective tissue and adipose tissue that can be found in the hypodermis. But we will not touch too much on the hypodermis. I think I have one slide on the hypodermis in a little bit, and it says pretty much all of the things that I'm saying right here. So this is going to be a low-yield topic for us. I definitely want you to know this. I'll tell you what I want you to know about the hypodermis, but we will not be touching too much on the hypodermis. We're really going to focus more on the epidermis and the dermis. And both the epidermis and the dermis are each going to have their own layers. So we can see as we go to this little section of the skin, you can see the epidermis is this outermost portion, and then there are hairs that are going to be coming out here, which are also part of the integumentary system. And then under the epidermis will lie the dermis. And you can see that there's actually two major regions found here within the dermis, the papillary layer and the reticular layer. So these are going to be our two major dermal regions, but there are actually 5 layers of epidermis. Now, before you get scared, and whenever I tell you that we have 5 layers of the epidermis, I've got a really nice mnemonic that will hopefully help you to remember these layers. So I will mention that when we get to the epidermis. But from this picture, you can see how involved the integumentary system is. We not only just have this outer covering that is going to wrap around our bodies, but we also have hair. Hair is going to serve a sensory function as well. When things brush past our hairs, that's going to indicate that something is touching us in that region. And there's also a lot of vascularity to the dermis. You can see all these different blood vessels in here. So there's going to be lots of glands. You can see these sweat glands right here, and there's going to be some oil glands over here. There are certain muscles that are going to be found in our integumentary system as well that will have certain functions. We'll also have certain sensory receptors, namely the Meissner corpuscle and the Pacinian corpuscle that can be found down here. And these are going to help to sense touch within the skin. And so while the integumentary system might seem fairly simple on the surface, no pun intended, it is actually very complex and involved as we go deeper and deeper down. And we can see this section here of the skin and how many different structures can be found within the skin. And especially when we go back onto the last slide that we covered and the different functions, we can see how integral the integumentary system is to the rest of the body. So these are just a few pictures to show us some of the layers of the integumentary system. We can look at these through different types of microscopes. You can see we've used a few different types of microscopes in these pictures. We've used an electron microscope here to show us a different view. We can see that we've zoomed in here a little bit more on the epidermis up here. This is the epidermis. We can see these different layers of the epidermis, which you will all be much more familiar with in just a few slides. And we can also see the dermis right here. So again, what we need to be focusing on is the epidermis is really going to be made up of an epithelial tissue, while the dermis is going to be primarily connective tissue. Now, remember the difference between epithelial and connective tissue. Epithelial tissue is going to have lots and lots of cells with lots and lots of junctions. So we'll see lots of cells and very, very little extracellular matrix. So we can really see that the epidermis up here is going to have lots and lots of cells. But with the dermis, as we go a little bit lower here, we'll see that there are going to be fewer cells that can be found in here. So we're going to start with the epidermis. Now before we get into the layers of the epidermis, I'm going to take a minute to introduce a few of the different types of cells that will frequently be found within the epidermis. Now all of this information that I'm about to cover can also be found on page 147. So I will say that even though I'm not going to copy and paste page 147 and put it on the slides, I would like you to go look at this page. Since I've highlighted this in red, I'm going to tell you that everything on page 147 is fair game for the test. So there's not a lot of information on page 147, but I want you guys to make sure that you go and give that page a read. So the four major cells that we will find in the epidermis are listed here towards the right. We have the keratinocytes, the melanocytes, the intraepidermal macrophages, which can also be called the Langerhans cell, and the tactile epithelial cells, which can also be called the Merkel cell. And you can see that each one is going to have a fairly different structure, each one's going to have unique characteristics, and that's going to give these individual cells their functions within the integumentary system. So we'll start here by introducing the keratinocyte. The keratinocyte is going to be the most common of our epidermal cells. These make up about 90% of all of the cells that can be found in the epidermis. As their name suggests, keratinocytes are going to be cells that make keratin. They are producing the protein keratin, which is a very, very tough and fibrous protein, and that's going to help to protect the skin and the rest of our bodies from damage. So keratin as a protein makes things very, very firm. Keratin is going to be the primary component that makes up fingernails. So keratin is a very, very firm protein that provides a lot of protective functions. And certain areas of the skin, such as the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, are going to have a little bit more keratin, and that helps to make these areas of skin a little bit thicker. Now we also will have the melanocyte. Now, as the melanocyte's name will suggest, this type of cell is going to be producing the pigment melanin. Melanin is a protective pigment because it's going to absorb ultraviolet light. Now, one thing that's also rather interesting is that melanocytes are going to shoot out these little projections with these melanin granules. That's what these little dots are in here. Those are melanin granules, and they're actually going to give them to the keratinocytes. So the keratinocytes are actually going to be the cells that contain the melanin pigments, but the melanocytes are going to be the ones that make it. So these slender projections here are actually going to be important for passing on our melanin pigments to keratinocytes. And these slender projections are actually going to be found in different layers of the skin than the melanocyte will itself. So we will touch on the location of these cells and where their different structures are going to be found in a few slides. But the melanocyte is going to make melanin, and it's going to give it to the keratinocyte. The next cell we have are the intraepidermal macrophage. Now these can also be called the Langerhans cell, and I'd like you to know these as both because these are often referred to by this name, the Langerhans cell. So macrophages are a type of immune cell. They're going to participate in immune reactions, and those are going to be at different microbes that are entering the skin. Think about the integumentary system and where it's located. It's very susceptible to capturing bacteria from different places. It's very easy for bacteria. It's going to be the first place that bacteria are going to go to infect, and it's going to be one of the first places that bacteria are able to access on our bodies. So we need to have these immune cells that can be found sort of squeezing through our epidermis to counter these different pathogens that are always trying to infect our bodies. So the macrophages are going to be patrolling through the skin. They're going to be squeezing through different skin cells and looking for different pathogens that have made their way into our bodies, and it's going to destroy them. Lastly here are the tactile epithelial cells, which can also be called the Merkel cell. This word tactile means touch, so the Merkel cell is going to be attached here to a sensory neuron. So when these cells are disturbed in some way, that's going to send signals up here to the sensory neuron. So if we are to push into our skin and we touch something and that's going to bend our skin inward or invaginate our skin in some way, that's going to be sensed. Those mechanical changes are going to be sensed here by the Merkel cell. Now the Merkel cell are going to be the least common type of cell that we will find in our epidermis. And they'll also be found in the deepest layer, and we're going to go over the layers of the skin in just a minute. But each of these cells are going to be found in different locations throughout the epidermis. So on top of having 4 different types of cells, we're also going to have 2 different types of skin. And each of these skins are going to be different based on the layers of the epidermis that can be found at the different parts of our bodies. That'll make a little bit more sense in just a few slides. But what's important for us to understand is we have 2 types of skin, thin skin and thick skin. Now, thin skin and thick skin are going to differ in many, many ways. But the most important thing to note about thick skin is that it can be found on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. Those are the only 2 places on our bodies that are going to have thick skin. Everywhere else is going to have thin skin. Now, thin skin can also be called hairy skin because thin skin will contain hair follicles. That's just hair is going to exist on thin skin. Hair cannot be found on thick skin. So the major difference between these 2 is where they're found. Thick skin is on the palms and the soles, while thin skin is going to be found everywhere else. And while there are major differences between these 2 types of skin, the biggest difference is that thick skin is just going to have 1 extra layer than thin skin will have. So when we get into the layers of the epidermis on the next slide, that will make all of these different types of skin and all of these cells make a little bit more sense. And we're going to bring them together with these different layers of the epidermis. So there are a total of 5 layers that make up the epidermis. From superficial to deep, those layers are the stratum corneum, the stratum lucidum, the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. Now this is indicated, I think, pretty well here on the slides, but I'll just mention that the stratum corneum is our most superficial layer. So this is the layer that actually contacts external things. This is the layer when you look at your skin, you're seeing this outer layer of stratum corneum. And the stratum basale is going to be the deepest layer. And so these are going to go in this order from superficial to deep. Now, if we look over here, we can actually see these different layers that have been laid out in this little picture here. So this picture shows how each layer of the skin is going to be made up of different types of cells, different colored cells, and cells that are going to have different structures and characteristics, and that are found in different areas of their life cycle. So again, you can see the stratum corneum out here, the stratum lucidum here, the stratum granulosum, our stratum spinosum, and lastly the stratum basale. So those are our 5 layers of the epidermis. Now, as I was explaining on the last slide, we have thick skin and we have thin skin. And in thick skin, there's only 1 extra layer. So this stratum lucidum is going to be the layer that's present in thick skin. This is the major difference between thin and thick skin. Each of these layers of the epidermis are going to be found in our skin. And you can see here that thin skin is going to have 4 layers and thick skin will have 5 layers. So essentially, in thin skin, we're just going to have the stratum corneum. We will not have the stratum lucidum, and we'll have the rest of these 3. So thin skin is going to have the stratum corneum, stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and the stratum basale. Those 4 layers will be found in thin skin. But where we have thick skin, which is on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet, we will have all 5 of these layers in this order. So the stratum corneum is going to be made up of dead keratinocytes. There's going to be mostly dead keratinocytes. Our stratum lucidum is also going to be dead keratinocytes, but they're just going to have different concentrations of keratin. And I'll explain this again on the next slide. The stratum granulosum is actually going to be the last layer of our skin that will have live cells. These cells are starting to break down. The stratum granulosum are named because these cells are going to have lots of different granules, these different pigmented cytoplasmic granules. The stratum spinosum is a very large layer. It's going to be also containing lots of keratinocytes, but we'll also see some intraepidermal macrophages in here as well. And then the stratum basale is going to be our deepest layer here, and we'll have these tactile epithelial cells, as well as melanocytes found here in this stratum basale. So let's look at some of the characteristics for each of these different epidermal layers. Now these are oriented a little differently, so I'm actually going to go to this slide and go from the stratum corneum to the stratum basale. So as I go through these, I am referring to each of these layers from superficial to deep. And the mnemonic that I'm going to give you to help you remember each of these layers and in which order they will sit will also be from superficial to deep. So I'm just going to start here. So the stratum corneum is essentially going to be just a bunch of dead keratinocytes. There's going to be just a few layers, up to 50, up to a lot of layers. So this can really range based on how thick this layer of stratum corneum is going to be. But these cells are going to be filled up with keratin. These keratinocytes are going to be filled up with keratin, and they're going to be dead. They're not going to be living anymore, but they'll have this keratin, and this is what's going to be providing some structure to our skin and protecting the inner layer of our bodies. Now the stratum lucidum, this is the very special layer that can only be found in thick skin. The stratum lucidum can only be found in thick skin, so make sure you note that. That is very, very important that you understand these different layers and where they can be found. So this is only going to be found in the palms and soles. So the palms, the skin of our fingers, and the soles of our feet. That's where the stratum lucidum can be found. Now these are going to be some more layers of flat, dead keratinocytes, but these are just going to have more keratin than the keratinocytes of the stratum corneum will have. So the stratum lucidum are extra pumped with keratin, and this makes sense because keratin is a much firmer protein, and it also makes sense that we're going to have these on the palms of our hands as well as the soles of our feet. These are areas of our bodies that are constantly going to be receiving some type of traffic. As we walk, the soles of our feet are going to be constantly pushed against the ground, and we need that extra protective layer. Our hands are going to be constantly touching different things, and we need our hands to be able to carry out certain tasks. So these are areas of our bodies that are going to be receiving extra traffic. And so because these areas are subject to more external stimuli, we're going to have this thick layer of stratum lucidum. Now the stratum granulosum, this is going to be our last cell layer that's going to have live cells. So these are also going to have keratinocytes. However, the keratinocytes in this layer are still alive, but they're starting to break down. Their organelles are beginning to degenerate, and these cells are going to have lots of cytoplasmic granules. Cytoplasmic granules are just pigments that can be seen under the microscope. So this layer tends to stain a little darker than the other layers of the epidermis. So the stratum granulosum is this last layer where we're going to have these live cells, and they're starting to break down. And these cells are going to have pigments as well. We'll see these clearly on the next slide. That will take us into the stratum spinosum. So the stratum spinosum does tend to be a much larger, much thicker layer. So these are going to have lots of keratinocytes found in the stratum spinosum. And these keratinocytes are going to be alive. And we'll also have the intraepidermal macrophage, which also is known as the Langerhans cell, that can be found in the stratum spinosum as well. So this is going to be the major layer that's going to contain these macrophages for our immune functions and protection of the body. So the spinosum is containing a lot of these different macrophages. And we also will have the projections of melanocytes. Remember, I mentioned earlier that the melanocytes are passing melanin pigments to our keratinocytes. So those melanocytes will have those projections. So those projections themselves are going to be found in the spinosum. And we'll see that the melanocytes themselves are actually going to be found in the stratum basale. So the melanocytes are setting up in the stratum basale, and they're going to be projecting into the stratum spinosum. Now, as the stratum basale is our deepest layer, we're also going to have lots of stem cells that are constantly undergoing cell division. And these are going to make new keratinocytes. So remember what I said about epithelial tissue in Chapter 4. Epithelial tissue forms the coverings of surfaces. Now, while our epidermis is epithelial tissue, this is covering the outside of our bodies. And the epidermis is constantly under threat of scraping against different external stimuli and knocking cells off. So we have to have ready cell division taking place at all times in our epidermis, and that is going to be taking place in the stratum basale. We're also going to find our Merkel cells, or our tactile epithelial cells, here in the stratum basale, as those are going to be presenting sensory signals to the brain. So you can remember that the stratum basale is the deepest layer, because remember, when we talk about epithelial tissue, we have an apical side and we have a basal side. So this is, you could sort of just imagine that this sounds like the stratum basal. This is that deepest layer, the deeper basal layer. So that's how we'll remember each of these. Now, I admit that there's a lot of layers here, and each layer is containing something different. And so how are we going to remember the order in which these layers can be found? And that's why I'm going to share a mnemonic that I created whenever I was studying these layers that helped me to remember the order in which these layers lie. So the first word of each of these layers is stratum. So we're going to sort of wipe this out of the way, and we're going to take the first layer of each of these second words here: corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, and basal. So again, this is a mnemonic that I made when I was studying. I had to learn all of these different layers in probably the course of a couple days, and so I was very stressed, and so I had to make whatever mnemonic up I could to make sure I remember these. So the mnemonic goes: Chester loves grabbing some booty. Chester loves grabbing some booty. That's going to be the mnemonic that we can use to remember the order in which these epidermal layers lie. So this was definitely helpful to me. I hope it is helpful to you, and I hope it brings you a laugh as well as you are going through this this information here in Chapter 5. So we've just covered the 5 layers of the epidermis. That's going to take us into the dermis. Now, fortunately, the dermis is only going to have 2 layers, so you won't have to remember all 5 layers for the dermis. You just have 2 layers, and there's only going to be a few things of each of these layers that I'm going to want you to know. So the 2 layers in the dermis are the papillary layer and the reticular layer. The papillary layer is going to be more superficial and actually contacting the epidermis, while the reticular layer is going to be found deep to the papillary layer and contacting the hypodermis. So the papillary layer is going to contain lots of blood vessels. There's going to be a lot of capillaries that are found in this papillary layer. So since the papillary layer is more superficially located, this is going to be the area that's going to be more likely to have these sensors that can be found in them. It makes more sense for these touch receptors to be found in this papillary layer of the dermis rather than the reticular layer. You're going to learn a lot more about Meissner corpuscles in Chapter 17, but for now, these are just different sensors we have in the papillary layer that are going to sense touch. They're going to help us to give us the sensation of feeling in our skin. And we also have a structure known as dermal ridges. Dermal ridges here is highlighted in red, so I definitely want you to know dermal ridges. Dermal ridges are going to be these waves that can be found between the epidermis and the dermis, and so they're going to be sort of connecting the dermis and the dermis, and these waves, these ridges or invaginations that we will find in the papillary layer are going to give us what we know as fingernails. So these ridges are going to be sort of pulling down on the epidermis, and that's what gives a wave-like appearance to our epidermis that presents as fingerprints. Now the reticular layer is going to be the deeper portion. It's going to be found deep to the papillary layer. And if you can remember from Chapter 4, I said that there was a lot of dense irregular connective tissue that can be found in the skin. Remember, dense irregular connective tissue has an irregular collagen fiber arrangement. So this gives strength in many directions, as our skin can constantly be pulled in any direction. So there's going to be a lot of dense irregular connective tissue, and that will be found housed within the reticular layer. The reticular layer is also going to be the home for our different glands that we find, the sebaceous oil glands and the sudoriferous sweat glands. These will be found housed within the reticular layer of the dermis. So again, I'll say you can see how involved our skin is. There's quite a bit that can be found in the different layers of our skin. And we'll take some time in the next video to discuss these different accessory structures that can be housed here within the dermis. There are also going to be several pigments that we find in the skin. So melanin, hemoglobin, and keratin are 3 different pigments we have that give skin its color. So melanin, as I mentioned a few slides ago, is going to be produced by the melanocytes, and melanin is going to be passed to keratinocytes to absorb ultraviolet radiation. Those melanocytes, remember, are found in the stratum basal. Hemoglobin is also going to be a pigment that we see. This is a reddish pigment, and this is what gives blood its reddish color, because our red blood cells are going to have hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the protein that will help to carry oxygen to our tissues. Keratin is a yellow-orangish pigment that we will find in the stratum corneum, our most superficial layer, as well as adipose tissue. If you've ever had the opportunity to see adipose tissue up close, you'll note that it has a yellowish color. So the reason that we discuss skin pigments is because there are some pigmentation disorders, which we're going to discuss on the next slide. And we can also clinically use specific skin pigments that are going to help us to diagnose certain conditions. So on this slide, we're going to go over some pigmentation disorders, and on the next slide, we'll talk about some clinical ways that we can use pigments to diagnose certain issues. So there are 2 pigmentation disorders we're going to mention: albinism and vitiligo. So albinism is characterized by an absence of pigment in the skin, the hair, and the eyes. And this absence is going to be caused by a defective enzyme that's not going to allow us to produce melanin. So when this particular enzyme is not working properly, we can't produce melanin. And so if that enzyme is broken, if that enzyme's not working right, and it can't produce melanin, that's going to leave us with an absence of pigment throughout the body. And you can see that this gentleman here has albinism. This is what is known as a congenital disorder, which means that this is genetic. So our first pigmentation condition is albinism. Our second is vitiligo. Now, vitiligo is going to cause depigmentation, but in patches in the skin. You can see that these three individuals here are going to be presenting with vitiligo. And this is going to produce pigmentation in patches. So you can see that this is not a full depigmentation, but it is going to cause depigmentation in certain areas in the skin. So you can see these individuals are presenting with this condition. Now, vitiligo is not actually going to have a known cause, a full known cause, but it is thought that this is also going to be a genetic disorder. However, it is thought that this genetic condition is actually coupled with a deficiency of the immune system, so an autoimmune condition where antibodies, which are just proteins that are going to latch on to foreign invaders, are actually going to be autoantibodies, and those are going to end up attacking our own melanocytes. So that's what an autoimmune disease is. When our own immune system creates antibodies that are going to be for pathogens, but they're accidentally made to attack some type of cell within our own bodies. So these autoantibodies are going to attack melanocytes. And if we destroy melanocytes, we're not going to be able to create the pigment melanin. And those will not be able to any further be passed on to our keratinocytes. And so that's going to leave these patches here in the skin. But I'll say more importantly for your test here are the abnormal skin colors that can be used in the clinical scenario. So skin color normally does range. However, these conditions are going to be indications that there might be some kind of condition that's going on here. So we'll start with cyanosis. So cyanosis is a bluish color. Cyanosis is our first abnormal skin color. This is a word that means the skin is appearing in some sort of bluish manner. And what this is going to indicate is that our hemoglobin is not properly oxygenated. So we're not getting enough oxygen being brought into the body, and our hemoglobin is not attaching to enough oxygen. So again, these different pigmentations here can indicate that patients might have certain clinical issues. Redness is often going to be indicative of inflammation. If you have some type of inflammation or immune reaction taking place, that's going to be with a reddish color, or allergies perhaps. Oftentimes, if you get an allergen in your eyes, that's going to cause your eyes to get red. Fever perhaps, or hypertension, which just means high blood pressure. These are all going to be indicated by a red color or a reddish color. Paleness can mean low blood pressure. So this is the opposite of hypertension. If we have low blood pressure, this can present with a pale color. So when you go into the physician's office, they're going to be looking for these different abnormal skin colors. Emotional stress can also be indicated by paleness. Jaundice refers to a yellowish color, and yellowish colors often indicate some type of liver disorder. Bruises, black and blue colors, these are going to indicate that blood has escaped from the cardiovascular system. So again, while skin color can range, it's normal. Certain individuals are going to be a little bit more pale than others. Certain individuals are going to be a little bit redder than others. But that being said, these abnormal, an abnormal amount of these skin colors is going to be something that can aid in the diagnosis of particular conditions. That will take us here onto the hypodermis. Now remember, I said that the hypodermis is not technically part of the skin. This is going to be attaching to the reticular layer of the dermis. So you can see the subcutaneous layer right here. And that's going to be one of the things I want you to know about the hypodermis, is that it can also be called the subcutaneous layer. The hypodermis is going to have lots of adipose and areolar connective tissue that can be found in here. That's what this yellowish stuff down here, this is going to be adipose tissue. And this layer is going to help to attach our skin to all the organs that can be found under the hypodermis. So in summary here for this first part of the video, you can see that the epidermis is going to be this superficial layer. It's going to have lots of other layers found in it. Chester loves grabbing some booty. And then the dermis is going to be laying just below that. And we have the papillary region and the reticular region. And each region is going to contain different structures that are going to help give the integumentary system its overall function.